Well, welcome everybody. Thank you very much for coming out. It's kind of a little drizzly night. And of course, if you aren't here, you could be at a mayoral debate, one of about the 500th we've had in Toronto. My name is Jim Melvin. I'm the MC for this evening. Tonight, we're going to hear some lively discussion and a presentation. Presentation will be from Ron Williams. I want to mention that the events are being taped and filmed for future use by the CSLA. Before I begin, though, I would like Faye Langmaid to please come forward and say a few words about the LACF and the reason behind this evening. Faye.
Thank you, Jim. As he said, I'm Faye Langmaid, and I'm the chair of the Grants Program for the Landscape Architecture Canada Foundation, or LACF. We've partnered with the OALA in collaboration with the CSLA to celebrate this important milestone in the evolution of our profession. That milestone is the publication of Ron Williams' Landscape Architecture in Canada. Yay! This book is the first comprehensive scholarly documentation of the history and evolution of our profession in Canada. With this publication, the story of our profession and the legacy of our work is now readily available to the public, other professions and professionals, scholars and students, and from what I understand from friends on Twitter, followers, that Ron's cross-country tour is going very well, as much as it's exhausting for him. The LACF is a charitable foundation whose sole aim is to solicit funds and receive donations in support of research, communication, and scholarship that meet the ideals of the profession of landscape architecture. The foundation is extremely proud to have been the financial supporter of this book since Ron first began compiling his research about 14 to 15 years ago. But his knowledge of that topic goes back way further. In some ways, I think that this may be your life work. The support was possible because of dozens of Canadian Society of Landscape Architecture members having made annual tax-deductible contributions to LACF. And it's really easy. Just go on our website, and there's a box that says donate, and you donate. And equally important, all the components of CSLA, the different associations like OALA, have made major donations to LACF from the profits of the CSLA congresses that they have hosted. So I especially want to thank the more than 50 donors who responded to a special request in 2012, which resulted in raising enough funds needed to assure that the book would be published in both French and English at the same time. So I'll turn the mic back to Jim.
Thanks very much, Faye. And this is just one of many things that the LACF supports. And I can't stress enough how much your donations help to do studies and research within landscape architecture. So tonight's events, I'll give you a brief outline, is there'll be a presentation by the author, and then that will be followed by a conversation with Leo DeSorcy. And then after that discussion, we'll open the floor to questions or general discussion, however you like. But let me tell you a little bit about the two gentlemen that will be gracing our stage tonight. And you notice the chairs aren't red, so it's not Stroumboulopoulos. Won't be him. Okay, Mr. Ron Williams, longtime professor of the École d'Architecture de Paysage of the University de Montréal. Ron is a Montreal landscape architect and architect. As a founding partner of the Montreal landscape architecture and urban design firm WAA, Williams Asselin Acue and Associates, he participated in many important and award-winning projects, including the Montreal Beach Park on Île Notre-Dame, the Biodôme de Montréal, the Jardin de l'Espace Saint-Roch, and the rehabilitation of Avenue Honor Mercer in Quebec City. Mr. Williams is a fellow of the Canadian Society of Landscape Architects and of the Royal Architecture Institute of Canada. He was honored in 2007 with the Lifetime Achievement Award of the CSLA. His book, Landscape Architecture in Canada, A History of Canada's Design Landscapes, was recently published by McGill Queen University Press and the Presses de Université de Montréal in English and French versions. And if anyone has bought it, and I see a lot of them out there, or is carrying it, it is quite the tome. It is very heavy, and they always say there's at least one book in all of us. So Ron, one. We're still looking for more.
Okay, that's it.
The other gentleman that will be gracing the stage after Ron's presentation is Leo DeSorcy. Leo is the program manager of urban design in North York District of the City of Toronto. He's worked for the City of Toronto since 1988 and has been in North York since 1998. He worked at the City of Toronto. His work at the City of Toronto has included a balance of cutting-edge policy work, review of large site redevelopment, and infill development projects. Some of those include the University of Toronto Secondary Plan and Master Plan, Lawrence Heights redevelopment, the King's redevelopment, Downsview Park Secondary Plan, and York University Secondary Plan. I know Leo from his work because he's instrumental in developing policies for the City of Toronto, and that includes work within the public realm and built form. And it includes things such as the Toronto Urban Design Handbook, the Tall Buildings Guidelines, Infill Townhouse Guidelines, and it says here he's very proud of his Midtown focus, a young Eglinton Streetscape Parks and Open Space Master Plan, which was approved this summer. So watch for that to be coming to your local area. He is a graduate of the University of Manitoba. Yes, I didn't know that. I am as well, so we're alma mater here. With a Bachelor of Environmental Science, and the University of Toronto with a Bachelor of Architecture. He's taught at the University of Toronto Daniel School of Architecture since 1984. So I'll ask Ron to come and make his presentation. Ron Williams. Thanks, Ron.
Thank you very much, Jim. Thank you very much, Jim. Can you hear me okay? Everyone? Yeah. Okay. And I wanted to thank Faye and all of the people who work with the foundation, Cecilia Payne and many others who helped tremendously, and the many members of OALA, a number of whom are in this room, who helped out financially and with all sorts of other kinds of support, providing images for the book and reading chapters and paragraphs, et cetera. I'd like to thank Ina Budrevics for organizing the evening tonight, and Jane Welsh and Leo DeSorcy also for their participation. And my wife Sachi, who has come along with me on almost all of the trips where we took these pictures and helped me through the long period of time that it took to put the book together, both with their patience and in a number of very specific ways, like that gigantic bibliography, which I think holds the world's record right now, but you never know. So when writing the book, certainly it was essential to talk about the pioneers and the people like Frederick Law Olmsted, who designed Mount Royal Park, and Frederick Todd, who was certainly Canada's outstanding landscape architect of at least the first half of the 20th century, a really brilliant person. But the subject that I wanted to kind of focus in tonight on a particular subject from the fourth section of the book, which is really the modern period from post-war 1940s and 50s up to more or less the present day, about 2010. The period of great progress and amazing, I think one could say, maturity and imagination in Canadian landscape architecture was the decade of the 60s and the years immediately preceding and following it, when for a fairly long period, instead of Canadian landscape architecture being let's say a regional offshoot of worldwide trends, which it had pretty much been until that time, things started to happen in Canada that were truly original and influenced the rest of the world. So my associate at University of Montreal, Peter Jacobs, calls that period the urban renaissance, and I like that expression a lot. It was really a period when the cities which had stagnated, the downtowns of cities had stagnated for many years, and all of a sudden a series of really outstanding projects were developed that changed them dramatically for the better. Now, I'm going to focus a little bit on Toronto, because here we are, and I think all of you know the early years of, about the early years of Toronto, when that modest little 10-block area was laid out by the water. And the area, the entire area above Queen Street was allocated to garden lots or estate lots for wealthy and well-established people. One wanted to bring them over here so that they would take charge of things and make this into a successful colony. And gradually, through the 19th century, one sees those, first, the expansion of the dense urban area in the lower part of the map over there. And then the garden lots and estate lots, first they filled in with estates as planned, and then residential areas started creeping into them, and a lot of other open space activities. So that's the Toronto that one would see in the 19th century. Early 20th century, there were a number of ambitious projects to change Toronto, to make it more, let's say, refined and orderly and well-structured. And probably the most well-known of these was a plan, what one might call the City Beautiful plan, made by John Lyle, an architect, for the Ontario Association of Architects, that proposed connecting the Union Station, which was being planned out at that time and on which Lyle worked, creating a new boulevard that would go directly north and terminate on a new city hall with a great public space between Osgoode Hall and the existing city hall. That wasn't realized at the time. World War I came along pretty quickly, and City Beautiful plans like that disappeared into the archives. But 50 years later, in the 60s, things started to happen, and in downtown Toronto, I can remember the great enthusiasm with which everyone greeted the both the fascinating architecture of the Toronto City Hall and this great expanse of Nathan Phillips Square, the skating rink, the multi-level, the dramatic profile, that really it gave Toronto a whole new image. I think it was pretty much the same level as the Sydney Opera House in Sydney, that made people feel that instead of being a provincial backwater, that this was an important place and was going to get more important. Just to the north of City Hall, another fascinating place, this time an interior plaza, was created at Eaton Centre. And we see that actually people from Europe played a very important role in both of those projects. Eberhard Zadler, born in Germany, came to Canada, I think in '51 or something like that, and was typical of a number of what I call sometimes brilliant Europeans who came across after World War II, trying to find new opportunities and get away from the terrible experiences that they had gone through. They were essential, I think, to the creativity of that period. Much work of great quality was also done by Canadians who had studied abroad, mostly in the States, like Austin Floyd, the landscape architect, who designed just to the south of City Hall the Four Seasons Hotel's interior garden. Now, it's not exactly an interior garden. It's an outdoor space entirely surrounded by a building. And so the plants that are used are regular outdoor plants, and the whole feeling and vocabulary is like a northern forest. But it really is a masterpiece, in my opinion, and it hasn't changed hardly at all, I think, since it was first created, which shows a lot of forbearance on the part of hotels, because they're always redecorating themselves, and I think brings kind of a soothing atmosphere to generations of people who have stayed in that hotel. Then going down the major streets towards the Toronto waterfront, a whole series of interesting projects of large scale and very well designed, including Toronto Dominion Centre, Commerce Court, etc., ending up at CN Tower, were all put together during a relatively brief period, so that by the mid-70s, one could take a look at that same area shown on John Lyle's drawing and understand that most of the things that he had proposed had happened one way or another. The new City Hall on the axis with Union Station, a great public square associated with the City Hall, a series of other important public and semi-public buildings, since those large office buildings and so on were really open to the public and had open spaces within them. So the boulevard was never built, but there is, that's shown in the that sort of red line there. That was never built as such, but there is a continuous underground connection that is the 1960s and 70s counterpart of Lyle's Boulevard. Now, a little further towards the water, there were a number of other interesting projects, really stunning new projects. And I think Ontario Place was really a groundbreaking project. Again, Eberhard Zadler was involved with his firm. The landscape architects were Huff and Stansbury. Michael Huff from Britain. I think Stansbury was an American, but I'm sure you know him better than me. And that was kind of the third element. There were Canadians who had studied in the States. In the East, Harvard was the favorite place to go. In Quebec, Amherst and Cornell. And in the West, mainly Berkeley, but some Canadians went to the Middle Western schools. A number of people came up from the States. The 60s was a very turbulent decade in the United States. Many people came here, and fortunately, they stayed. So there were really three different groups of people who made this decade happen. So this project, I know that it's always being changed and knocked about, but it's still a really original piece of work. And it had one of the very first really extensive children's play areas that featured water. And I don't know if it was the world's first water park or anything like that, but it was certainly a very exciting place for children and was widely copied. Other Canadian cities followed the same path during that period. Montreal, one can see the new skyscrapers, which completely changed the Montreal skyline at that time. Place Ville-Marie being the most visible and still the most famous, still probably the best address in Montreal corporate world, I believe. And when Place Ville-Marie was created, it was really wide open. There were no plants on the plaza after the third building was built. It was like a giant Italian piazza, And I think people were really ready for this kind of environment, the lighting, the paving, the axial relationship with McGill University and the mountain, the shopping center underneath, or shopping plaza underneath. So this became a place for major public gatherings. So every year that the Expos opened their season, they'd open it here with a big reception. And when Montreal was still winning Stanley Cups, the parade always ended here. You know, we've gone almost as long as you guys now, eh? So we can't say anything. So maybe this is the year for a Canadian team. We'll see. A number of other projects were really where landscape was an important ingredient, happened in Montreal around the same time. I'll just show one of them here. Place Bonaventure Roof Garden. The firm that was really, well, the architects were Arcop Associates, really a great Montreal firm from that time who still continue in one form or another until the present day. The Boston firm of Sasaki was the prime landscape consultants, but my former partner John Schreiber was the local on the project who actually chose the materials and so on, the hard landscape materials. Ottawa went through a number of fascinating changes. The orange line is the Spark Street Mall, which in its first manifestation was a little bit experimental. People weren't sure that it was really going to work. And it has been a pedestrian space, a very interesting pedestrian space ever since. It's had one major facelift. Other projects, if you look at the orange marks at the extreme left of the drawing, is the Garden of the Provinces, designed by Don Graham, one of those Canadians who studied at Harvard. And towards the right is the Rideau Canal and the National Art Center, designed by that same Arcop firm. So the Garden of the Provinces, I think Emile van der Meulen from Montreal designed that fountain, if I'm not mistaken. Can anybody confirm that? I'm almost certain that that was Emile. And this was really a terrific imaginative project, but projects like that were all over the place in the 60s. Out west, some fascinating things happened also. In Calgary, where the islands and shores of the Bow River had been occupied by industry and lumber yards since the beginning of the city. In that decade, finally, Princess Island became a beautiful public park. It's absolutely stunning in walking distance of the skyscrapers of downtown Calgary, which was also greatly enhanced at that time by a number of projects. Edmonton continued in a century-long development of a huge linear park right through the middle of the city, as you can see here. The North Saskatchewan River has gouged out a large, broad valley, and the river meanders down through the bottom of that valley. It was actually Frederick Todd in 1907 who proposed to the city that they should keep that whole space as a public park. It took a little while, and it took a couple of disastrous floods for people to be convinced of that, but that's what eventually happened. The final step in the creation of the park happened exactly a century after Todd's first plan. The orange lines are three City Beautiful proposals that were all suggested about that same time, early part of the 20th century, before World War I. The university on the south side, the Civic and Marketplace on the north, at the right-hand side of the drawing. And then in the center, the legislature. And in the 1960s, the forecourt of the legislature was redesigned to be a series of plazas and pools and basins that, to everyone's surprise, became a playground for people. This was taken on July the 1st, so there was Canada Day, and 100,000 people showed up to splash around in the legislature's forecourt plaza, which I don't think happens in a lot of other places, and might change a little bit the state image that Edmonton sometimes has. A number of outstanding projects also happened or were created on the West Coast, Vancouver. I think towards the mid to late 70s, Arthur Erickson and Cornelia Oberlander created this absolutely magnificent law courts composition. It's a 3-block long urban design that became a favorite place for people to enjoy themselves, as well as a perfectly efficient courthouse. One can see in the picture at upper right that Arthur Erickson tried to reflect the dome of the former law courts, which is now the art museum, which I think is going to relocate another time, but I'm not sure about that, in his dome for this outdoor theater. So that whole complex worked very well for a number of years. It's kind of being called into question right now as the activities around the space change, and Cornelia used these stramps as an interesting feature to get bicycles to be able to move through the site without disturbing people and pedestrians. Similar projects happened in medium and small cities. City Hall in Quebec City was designed by, the plaza was designed by Jan Hodeman, who was a landscape architect of Dutch origin, and became a very popular place for people to eat their lunch and enjoy themselves downtown. Clive Justice and his partner, oh my goodness, Adrian Brown's father, Jim Justice and, okay, well, we'll remember eventually. They designed this really superb little square in downtown Victoria in the middle of an astonishingly heterogeneous collection of historic and modern buildings. The Confederation Center of the Arts, Sachi and I were just there a couple of weeks ago at the Heritage Canada Convention. That was where we made our PEI presentation of the book, and it is still the cultural heart and soul of that small city, and probably a major source of tourist income, tourist wealth. My former partner, John Schreiber, designed a very interesting project in Quebec City with a pigeon house as the central feature. In the middle of the huge complex of new government buildings, which was part of the Quiet Revolution. And let's see, Jim Belisle, who's like me, a graduate of McGill, will remember the two sort of Germanic-looking names on this list. Norbert Schonauer, who was actually Hungarian, who was the planner who really worked out the carefully composed overall design at Charlottetown, and John Schreiber, who was actually Polish, who was both an architect and a landscape architect, and did a lot of really original work mostly in Quebec. The outstanding project of this time period, and I'm sure people in Toronto are just as happy to agree with this as people in Montreal, was Expo 67, because everyone worked together on this. All the landscape architects from across the country were involved in one way or another, either with provincial pavilions or in the planning. Macklin Hancock, for example, was one of the chief planners of Expo 67. This photo was taken by a friend of ours who was in charge of the La Ronde development from a helicopter just a couple of days before the project opened. And it was really a completely new vision of what a Canadian city might be like in the future. It turned out that that wasn't exactly the case. And people ask now, 50 years later, could we even do this at all? Well, if we did it then, I'm sure we could do it again if the opportunity arose. So just looking at a couple of the different parts of the fair. Cornelia Oberlander, in one of her many reinventions of herself, became Canada's really leading designer of children's environments with her Children's Creative Play Centre at the Canadian Pavilion at Expo 67. She had a Nova Scotia dory, she had water, she had mud. Children loved it, and it was supposed to be a waiting area before children went into the children's space inside, but they never went inside, they just stayed in her garden. Another extremely important part of that era was the expansion of the education facilities and really of the nature of education in Canada. Instead of being higher education, instead of being the province of the elite, became a major social goal. And new institutions were created from whole cloth. Other institutions that had existed for a long time were entirely rebuilt. And fortunately, those great designers were there to give them outstanding physical form. And right here in Toronto, I think it's only about 3 blocks away, is Massey College, outstanding project by Ron Tom, who, with its central courtyard, which is like a temporary or a contemporary rediscovery of the medieval cloister. Tom also designed Trent University at Peterborough, Ontario. Not all the buildings, but the overall plan and a number of the buildings, and related it extremely well to the drumlin and the Otonabee River, which are the major physical features of the site. The University of Victoria, if I'm not mistaken, was entirely built at that time. University of Montreal was greatly expanded and started to play a much greater role in higher education in Quebec. And the plan at the top left was drawn by my colleague Danielle Routaboul, who is a professor at University of Montreal Landscape School for many years. The University of Moncton was the crucial flagship for higher education for Francophones in the maritime provinces, and has had tremendous success. So it just changed the whole picture in that part of the country. In the western part of the country, Arthur Erickson designed the University of Lethbridge. Now, these people aren't landscape architects, but I think that their understanding of landscape, their ability to shape their buildings in consequence of the landscape, they really deserve the title. So Erickson Massey Architects, along with Don Vaughan, who was the chief landscape architect on the project, they did an astounding job on Burnaby Mountain for Simon Fraser University. So I think we can see that it's downtown, the recreation environments, education, just world-beating projects that people were coming to copy during that period. Now, Toronto continued, getting back to local affairs, Toronto continued to benefit from some original and thought-provoking projects in the following decades. Trinity Square, which is just near Eaton Centre, was, I think, a very thoughtful rediscovery of the cloister tradition in itself, and started to introduce what we would call a postmodern vocabulary in landscape architecture. Devonian Park, that little corner of Ryerson University, where perhaps for the first time in Canada, Canadian landscapes were used as an inspiration for a public garden, rather than landscapes from France or Italy or Japan, as had usually been the case. And right up to the present day, I think people in all parts of the country are really fascinated with what's going on in Toronto right now with the reconstruction of the port. That over a period of years, I guess starting in the 90s, a number of really essential projects have rediscovered the port lands as a great place to live, a great place for recreation. Our Montreal designer, landscape architect Claude Cormier, we're very glad that the people in Toronto have found his design interesting. He's started to bring this playful and sort of semi-ironic design approach to a number of the Toronto waterfront projects with, in collaboration with Janet Rosenberg and some others. And so I think this initiative from the 60s and the period both before and after, that continues. There's still a lot of creativity, and there are a lot of projects in Canada that are really trendsetters and that people from other parts of the world look at with interest. But I think if we were to try to identify one period where we really hit the ball out of the park, it would be the 60s. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ron. I'll ask Leo to join Ron on stage. Do you need something up here, Ron?
I was going to get Leo's questions, which
Oh,
I didn't.
okay.
But he's probably going to ask them.
Well, I've got new ones after seeing this one.
Good. That's good. Put him on the spot, Leo. Well,
And I didn't prepare set answers in.
certainly a complex time. What was happening in Canada in the 60s and 70s, and Ron, an admirable job of trying to summarize coast to coast to coast and talk about schools, critical thought, urban ideas, architecture, all of that together. So with that little bit of introduction, I'll let Leo start the discussion.
I just want to start by saying how much I enjoyed your book, and so I've got some questions that will deal specifically with the Toronto project. Being now a Toronto person, of course, mostly I just want to talk about Toronto and how important Toronto is, and that's what most of the people here want to hear. But first, I have some kind of general questions about the book. You've included a lot of landscapes that weren't designed by landscape architects. Why did you think that was important to tell the story?
Right. Well, let's see. I guess the most of the landscapes that are talked about in the book are design landscapes. They're designed by somebody, and probably half or more are designed by landscape architects. But I think that really interesting landscapes have been designed by people from other professions, whether architects, city planners, surveyors, even engineers occasionally, by gardeners, by gifted amateurs. And I think the focus, I think we can call all of those things landscape architecture if they're designed with care and thought, and they succeed as landscape architecture. So it's the product, not the authorship that is the key thing. But I also tried to include a certain number of vernacular or cultural landscapes, since a great many outstanding landscapes were not designed by a particular person, but were designed as part of an ongoing tradition by people who never identified themselves. Let's say traditional cemeteries are often extremely interesting, or housing clusters and just all kinds of things. There's even some natural landscapes, because the national parks was essentially an idea that was put forward by landscape architects, and where landscape architects are still very much involved in providing public access without wrecking the place. Yeah.
So starting with the Ice Age, a country that's thousands of miles or kilometers across, and all of these kinds of landscapes. Can you tell people a little bit how you structured the book to tell such a huge story in a kind of coherent way?
Actually, there were several ways that this could have been done. One was, let's say, trying to be completely encyclopedic and talk about all of the projects, or a series of vignettes that would try to be geographically balanced or something. But the structure of the book was decided at a meeting in September 2000 in Vancouver. The three people present were my wife, Sachi, Cornelia Oberlander, and me as an interested bystander. And at that time, it was decided that, or it seemed to the three of us that we should have a thematic approach. And so we knocked out a number of themes right at that meeting, and then later they were developed. Eventually, 24 different themes were identified. Each one has a chapter. And for each theme, the idea is to illustrate it with a few key projects that really represent the theme well. Each theme would be a time period or a place or, let's say, a great landscape idea like national parks or the great urban parks like Stanley Park or High Park. And so eventually there were 24, and they kind of grouped themselves naturally into 4 different sections, one being the colonial period, well, starting with the glaciers, of course, after the end of the colonial period. I'm glad you noticed that. What would Toronto be without the glaciers? All the soil that we're standing on right now was brought here by glaciers. Yeah. And then the 19th century is really the second section, Depression and War, third section, and then the modern period from 45 to more or less present.
So the book Genesis was in 2002 then, so you've been writing this book for 12 years?
Well,
14?
14 years really, since the idea was there that it would be a book.
Okay.
So before that, I guess Sachi and I were traveling around taking pictures and going to CSLA conventions and thinking about things, and I was teaching courses. I had taught for many years the course in landscape architecture history at University of Montreal, but it was a general world course in landscape history. But all of these things sort of started to, and I also had a large number of documents that somehow had fallen into my briefcase over that period.
The book is beautiful. I mean, it's beautifully published, and in it there are a lot of really beautiful pictures and lovely hand-drawn maps. In terms of visiting all these places, do you have a favorite one? Is there?
Oh, let's see. I guess favorite could be defined in different ways depending on criteria, but if it's really landscape design, beautiful, long-lasting landscape design, I think that the Public Gardens of Halifax is really the outstanding project in my opinion. It's basically a Victorian garden, and it still is. They had some damage, considerable damage with hurricane about 10 years ago, but they're coming back from that. And I think the way it's designed, when you're in that garden, you're in a separate world. It's created by fences and mounds and planting, but you don't see outside. You're in this special magic world, and I think it's really an outstanding project.
Perfect location to read the obituaries in the morning if you're if you're an old. Sorry, that's a Canadian joke. That's in terms of your travels. Were there any real surprises, places that you went to not expecting much and then coming away kind of excited,
There were
transformed?
several surprises. There were places that were really unusual and unexpected and almost ethereal, like the Haida Gwaii or Queen Charlotte Islands. There were a lot of places there that were really breathtaking. And in the far north also, the Ayuituk National Park, for example, it was just almost impossible to understand the scale of that place because there are no trees to measure it with. But one of the biggest surprises I had was in Saskatchewan, where I was visiting a homestead, which was a National Historic Site outside of Regina. And well, I thought I'd drive back along the Qu'Appelle River. And I stumbled on a little town called Lebret, which was basically Quebec transplanted a couple of thousand kilometers west, and was a pure statement of the early colonial period in Quebec. The church right down by the river, facing out across the river, hill behind with a chemin de la Croix, way of the cross that went up the hill, and it was very simple and austere, and I was absolutely blown away by that. And of course, there were Francophone settlers in the West in the 1820s and so on, and people with names like de Sorcy.
De Sorcy, yes.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, when you put the book together as well, it's full of quotes from interesting people. Who influenced the book the most of all those people that you spoke with?
Well, I was very fortunate to be able to interview a number of people, some of whom have passed away since, including Macklin Hancock here in Toronto. I spoke to Clive Justice, who's an amazing character, still going strong out on the coast. Cornelia had a tremendous impact on the book, both in its how it was created and how and the subject matter of the book. She also gave me, during that September 2000 period when we were out there on the coast, she gave me a huge box full of documents and said, "Ron, this is the book that I was going to write, but I never got around to it. I was too busy," she said. So this is yours. And so a lot of the detail and specifics in the discussion of Western Canada, particularly the West Coast, was Cornelia. But I think the person in the book who was the most amazing to me was Frederick Todd, that person I showed in the first slide, because of his huge achievement as a landscape architect who came from the States. He settled in Canada as the emissary of the Olmsted firm, working on little projects to finish off the Mount Royal Park project, and moved to Canada, set up his own office. It was on the first day of the new century, January 1st, 1900. At the age of 24, he started his office. And then when he was all of 27, he was hired to design Assiniboine Park in Winnipeg. And I don't think he was 30 yet when he started to design the Plains of Abraham in Quebec City. And he had already told Edmonton what they should be doing for the next 100 years by that time. And you know, just all sorts of amazing things go back to Frederick Todd, like Stratford. I think it was in that same decade, maybe 1904 or 1906, on New Year's Eve, because his letter was dated, he wrote a letter to the chairman of the building committee in Stratford, who were considering whether or not the railroad should go along the river. And he said, "No, that's a crazy idea. Don't do it. Make it a park." And that's exactly where the Stratford Shakespearean Festival is today. Apparently, they had a one-vote margin in the city council in favor of keeping that site as a park. So I think the festival brings them a lot more money than the train yards do these days. Yeah, but and his life was just full of these things. Yet he seems to have been a rather humble person, and not a bombastic, over-the-top character like some others. Like I think Thomas Mawson probably was. And he had some difficulties. We know that he was dumped from a number of projects. He didn't get paid for all the work he did in Ottawa. And so just an amazing character.
So let's get to the important part so we can talk about Toronto here. So enough of the generals. Your topic tonight was, and a big part of the center of the book is about the urban renaissance. These you describe as being populated by foreigners, mostly Europeans, who came here after the war, locals who were educated here, but then went either to graduate schools in the States, and then an American influx. Toronto was truly transformed by that generation, and yet by the 1970s, there was a kind of a reaction against the modern plan. So do you think that kind of reaction was inevitable and ultimately good for Toronto?
I think so. I think that that revolution had to happen. Modernism was a very powerful aesthetic idea that had very strong social and economic underpinnings. And it swept the board, and it became the only idea in town. And so every project had to be done in a modern idiom, or it was considered ignorant or crazy or inappropriate. And that much dominance of one approach to design, particularly a rather austere one, I think sooner or later people were going to say, well, these buildings really don't have much personality when you put them all in a row. Having one wonderful skyscraper surrounded by trees is fine, but if you have a whole city of them, it doesn't add up to a city. And isn't this plaza rather empty? So I think it started as a criticism here and there, and then people say, well, what about history? Why should we have thrown out everything that ever happened in the entire history of human beings as being irrelevant and stupid? Can't we learn from the Gothic period or the Renaissance? And so I think there was a whole series of different critiques of the modern movement that didn't form a coherent movement of its own. So I don't think that one could say that postmodernism has a clear philosophy. It has a whole bunch of different philosophies. But I think it was healthy for cities. And a lot of the projects that were built since the 60s, 70s, they're extremely rich and interesting, and people enjoy them. Yeah.
So in that same period, there was a real landscape architecture education in Canada for the first time. What role did the schools play in that big change?
Well, first, I think the 60s created the schools. Toronto and Guelph in 1965, our school at University of Montreal in 1968, and then Manitoba, I'm not sure exactly when it started, but about that same time. BC a little longer, I think because of interfaculty bickering. The truth can be told now. But imagine. Yeah.
It's a BC thing for sure.
Yeah. The schools had a huge impact. Once they were created, then we started to produce Canadian graduates who at first were playing junior roles and then gradually have moved up the ladder until today. Almost all projects are done by graduates of Canadian schools, and just occasionally a star from outside is brought in for a particular project, and that's not a bad thing. I think we can handle it. We have enough strength of our own. And the graduates of Canadian schools are not just doing landscape architecture in private, public, and parapublic sectors. They're doing a lot of, they're in all of those places, but they have also moved on to leadership roles well beyond landscape architecture. So one of our graduates, Sachi and I just noticed today, is one of the directeurs adjoints of the city of Montreal. She was probably the only honest person around, and so she became the assistant director of the city, and a very capable person who's really on top of things. Yeah. So I think the impact has been absolutely enormous.
So you finish your book with a few contemporary challenges. Do you want to briefly describe those? And
Okay.
then I
Sure.
have to ask if,
Yeah.
if you think the profession's up for those.
Oh, well, in fact, you know, that is the question that I tried to raise in the last chapter. The profession has met a lot of really difficult challenges. The Depression was a huge challenge, and the projects of that period are outstanding. But a few of the challenges that I mentioned are, well, for example, the banality of much of the landscape. And I have a picture in that last chapter, which is in Hamilton, Ontario, of a completely ordinary suburban commercial landscape, and it could easily be anywhere in North America. The tremendous change that's happening in agriculture. So a country that's entirely based on the family farm, and we don't realize, I think, how much that principle is at the foundation of our whole culture, is changing rapidly. Every year we have fewer, larger farms. And so that's a world in itself. Climate change and the challenge of resources are huge challenges. Sachi and I visited the oil sands. We felt that one couldn't write a book like this without looking at the largest project in Canada, the largest landscape project in Canada, and the one that has the most impact. And that is really a serious problem. I believe that the people who are working on that project have their hearts in the right place. They're trying to do the right thing. It's just that the efforts that are being put out to mitigate the impacts on the landscape are in no way commensurate with the scale of that challenge. So those are just some of the challenges that face us today. Densification of cities, also keeping a human environment as cities become more dense. So there's a lot of challenges out there that I think people are aware of, and the next 10 years will show how we handle them.
You have no crystal ball here?
Well, you know, I don't think that one can really predict. I think one could say, look, when we had these challenges as a profession in the past, we came through like champs. I gave a talk yesterday at Guelph that allowed me to really think in depth about the work done during the Depression. And it's amazing how much good work was done during that Depression. Much better, on average, than the work that was done as a response to economic conditions in our recent recession, I think. You know, the governments just didn't get their act together at all to do the kind of things like Montreal Botanical Garden, Royal Botanical Garden at Hamilton, et cetera. These are outstanding achievements in difficult times. Could we match them today? Well, I hope we could.
Cool. So before we open up the floor, I just have to ask, I know Jim was teasing you about one book. Is there, in the process of writing this book, is there another book in there? Or?
You know, there were a couple of themes that eventually wandered out of the book and aren't there, but I had written a lot about them. And that happened because when we were working on the French version first, and I had about 35% more words than they wanted. They wanted about 150,000 words, and I had maybe something over 200,000. So we had to cut out something. And the editors were very good. They said, Ron, there's two ways that you could do this. You could take 3 words out of every sentence, or you could look at the overall structure of the book, identify the areas that are the least relevant to the main thrust of your narrative, and put them aside for future treatment in lengthy articles in scholarly magazines. So I have some really good material that could become lengthy articles in scholarly magazines.
Well, we'll look forward to that, though.
Yeah.
This is great.
Great.
That's great. Thanks very much, gentlemen. Remain seated there. There might be some questions. So we'll take some comments,
you very much.
questions from the audience now. Is there anyone who has some questions? Jim?
I'd like to compliment you on your magnificent sketches. I think it enhances the book terrifically. Page 59 and 246, and then somewhere over here you have a picture up in the Valley Bay, St. Paul. Absolutely.
Oh.
I'd like to ask you, maybe, how did a guy who started in architecture and was exposed to a bunch of people, Gentile Tondino, Gordon Weber, Jonas Lehrman, Robert Schoenauer, Stuart Wilson, John Bland, a whole bunch of people, how did you end up having an interest in landscape architecture? What pushed you there to get
Right.
to then be involved in the history?
Well, let's see. I had lived and worked in Europe for a couple of years. Then coming back to Montreal, I worked for John Schreiber, who was a former professor of ours. He had studied landscape architecture at Harvard. He'd taken a couple of years of sabbatical, studied landscape architecture, and had started a landscape firm in Montreal. But he still did a lot of architecture. And so I was basically hired as a junior architect, but I was able to work on a number of landscape projects and look at the drawings for others, including Place Bonaventure Roof Garden. I didn't work on those drawings, but they were lurking about in the office, so I saw them. And I found it very interesting. And also at that time, as you recall, there was a social revolution in North America. There was an ecological crisis that was becoming more and more apparent every year. And I felt that the architects as a profession were not thinking about either of those crises. There was a lot of discussion about, could you really have a building with a pointed roof, or I'm exaggerating, it's a mean thing to say, sorry architects. But somehow landscape architecture had a serious message about ecology. That was the time of Ian McHarg and so on. And a serious message about how designers could at least contribute to resolving social problems. Oh, gee, who is that guy in New York City? Paul, Paul Freeberg, and Claire Cooper was just starting out in her explorations of the social aspects of landscape architecture at Berkeley. So I guess I was not the only one. I've run into a considerable number of people who, in the late 60s, kind of drifted from architecture into landscape architecture. I'm not sure if you fit that bill, but I think so also. Yeah. And I'm glad that that happened. I've been very happy practicing and teaching landscape architecture, and I've always respected architecture and even done a couple of buildings. But I think that landscape architecture has had a large impact and has been able to make contributions in those areas that were quite significant.
We still do, Ron. We still think landscape architecture is more relevant than architecture.
Well, I think
Other questions? Yes.
Question, is there any sense that you have that, looking at some of these projects, that there's a means for actually preserving these landscapes that were designed, since you commented in your discussion about hotels and obviously office buildings that have this nasty habit of constantly redecorating.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And ruining stuff that's been, very nicely designed, whether it's architectural or landscape.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And it's probably one of the big challenges a lot of designers have, where somebody just
Mhm.
decides to come and change the version.
Yeah. Well, it's certainly an emotional challenge when something that you think was really pretty good gets wiped out. I think all of us feel very bad about that. There are professions, interior designers seem to take it for granted that there's a shelf life to their projects. They maybe even design for that shelf life. It depends on what world you're in. Perhaps the institutional world, things last longer than the commercial world, where it seems like a generation, 20 to 25 years, is the maximum before there has to be a rethinking of design. I guess we have to understand that that's part of the social reality that we work with. But then there are individual cases where, there are individual cases where changes are proposed which are entirely inappropriate. And it's our duty to try to stop people from doing these crazy things. I've, at the suggestion of some friends in Heritage Canada and in the preservation movement, I added sorry about that. I added, or I actually took some material out of the last chapter that was getting kind of squeezed and didn't seem to fit, and put it in an epilogue, just discussing the whole issue of landscape preservation and why it should be done, how it can be done. It's a very brief discussion, but I think there have been some interesting successes in that field in the last 15 or 20 years, and there have been some backsliding also. But it's a very important issue, and so I tried to treat it, but it wasn't a main theme, but at least there's an epilogue that discusses that. Yeah.
Great. Other questions? Yes. Mrs. McDonald.
Which frankly is the reason why I practice landscape architecture anymore, because I was tired of being brought in at the last minute. So I do think that the profession, in terms of what I'm hearing, his voice is not loud enough in terms of asserting our skills and our contribution to urban development, which is my area of downtown. So I wonder what your thoughts are on how we can be heard more clearly as far as asserting our the role that we should be playing. More than some of the other, or at least standing shoulder to shoulder with some of the other.
Great. Well, I think a case could be made that landscape architecture attracts people who have rather diplomatic personalities, and doesn't attract a lot of people who are really aggressive. And I think there's a lot of go-getters in our profession. A lot of people are enthusiastic, they're ambitious, but I don't think that somehow arrogance is promoted, for example, in the schools, as it is in the schools of architecture. I mean, after spending 6 years in a school of architecture, I can certify that one is brought along to be arrogant and to stand up. Well, one theory is that everything that architects do, it looks the best, and it is the best on opening day. And then after that, everything is against it, gravity, rust, etc. And the architect has to fight to make his or her vision felt, and just learns to be a particular type of person. And I think that happened in school for most people. Landscape architecture schools, I think, try to inculcate a different set of values. And while these are great for understanding how nature works and how you can't just have slopes that meet like that, that if you don't round them off a little bit, then nature will. Architects never learn that. I don't know why. But I think that we really have to be more outspoken. We have to band together and act. I think it's happening. I think, you know, all of the professional associations across the country are becoming more and more professional and well-organized and out front and putting landscape architecture on the front page. So I think that it's happening, but I think that there's something deep in the values of the profession that actually is harmful to the visibility and impact, maybe. Perhaps that's a theory, but I don't know.
Yes, Nina?
Thank you, Ron, for a very insightful and thoughtful look at our history, and for a very comprehensive, despite your earlier decision not to be comprehensive. I think it is actually a very comprehensive look backwards. Whether or not it's from relation period forward, I'm not sure, but I think it's incredibly helpful. But on that note of speculating forward, I would love to hear your thoughts on the role of landscape architectural design, and you hinted at a little bit. What is the role of design in rethinking the changing notion of the wild and the wilderness in Canada at this moment when our country is urbanizing like never before, and where our biological diversity and our ecological integrity is arguably hugely at risk within 2 hours of the U.S. border? What might the role be of design?
Well, I guess it was about maybe perhaps 20 years ago now, the Canadian National Parks put together a very extensive study. Michael Huff was involved in that study of the ecological integrity of the national parks. And it turned out that almost all of the national parks were in serious trouble on that score, including parks like Wood Buffalo Park that it's almost impossible to get to, or even if you're there, to get into. I think that they made the wrong conclusion at the end of their report, and their conclusion was that we should regard these national park sites as being essentially protected zones, and that, in fact, we had always misunderstood what their definition was supposed to be. They're supposed to be protected zones, and people are sort of allowed in now and then. I think that was the conclusion they came to, which I think is wrong. I think that they were always meant to be parks. They were always meant to be there for human use. And Frederick Law Olmsted, in his very first essay about the national parks in 1864 or something, said, if we don't preserve these parks for people, but just try to keep people out, they will never be supported by the population. There will never be money for them. They will be a failure, and all the forests will be cut down and the minerals will be mined. So I think that we have to get this balance where the wildlands, some of them for sure have to be really protected, and we have to just plain keep people out. But that's not a lot of the wildlands. I think just what we do in these sites has to be very carefully thought through. And in fact, I go back to that first essay by Olmsted. I think he created the genetic code for what national parks should be. He said, we must allow human access, but the minimum should be provided. It should be just enough that people can observe nature and benefit from it. So for example, that recent construction in, is it Banff or Jasper, I guess, of the transparent viewing platform. To me, that's an absolutely ridiculous and crazy idea. That's not what the national parks are for. You know, maybe we should be traveling a little more with horses and on foot, and a little less with cars. I do believe that the wild landscapes are sufficiently robust that they can be open to people and can continue to be wild, as long as we do it carefully and sensitively and thoughtfully and have good designers working on it, and then do what they say. Does that answer your question?
Well, I think it offers us lots of food for thought for what the role of design manifests. I think you've offered us some of your own insights into the notion of the wild, and I appreciate that. Thank you.
Okay. I guess the main rule I think it was one of my professors at Berkeley who said, there's really only one major rule about wild lands and national parks. Don't put the support facilities in the main resource. And, you know, 90% of the things that are really stupid is because somebody decided that it would be great to put the picnic area right in the middle of the main resource. So just correcting that would already pull things back.
Great. Yes, William.
Oh, gee. Well, just as one example, there's a series of projects in the city of Quebec that were carried out over the last 20 years. Our firm was involved in a couple of them, but many other firms also, that were carried out under the leadership of a really good mayor, Jean-Paul Lallier. He came into office in 1990, I think, as a reform candidate. And basically, his opponents at that time were trying to bring downtown Quebec City back to life because it was dead by changing it into a sort of a suburban shopping center. And he said, no, this is not the way to go. He actually called Ken Greenberg from Toronto to advise him on this. And Ken gave him a lot of good advice, and he followed it. And he put together an excellent team of administrators who established a long-term program. I won't mention each of the projects, but it involved derelict downtown areas, industrial areas along the St. Lawrence River, the main freeway entrance into Quebec City from the north, which more or less continued to be a freeway right up to the gates of Parliament. And so he just took these things on one after another, put teams on top of the projects, and I think he was reelected 4 times, and each time a number of important works were done. And I do believe that those will prove to be valuable in the long term because they've restructured the whole city, brought a lot of new people downtown, a lot of industries. Just for example, the newspaper Le Soleil had left the downtown area and gone out to Sainte-Foy, which is out in the suburbs. And then after these projects were finished, it came back because that's where the action was. And so, you know, those are success stories. I'm sure there are others all across the country.
Other questions? Peter at the back.
I'd like to just roll the conversation back a little bit. You mentioned that there were some themes that you talked about,
Mm-hmm.
and that immediately raised my curiosity as to what those might be. But the other side of the question would be, well, whether the themes would control what do you see as the
Oh.
you writing or not? What are the really important kind of directions of research and investigation?
Well, the themes, there were 2 main themes that I cut out entirely. One was more developed than the other. And that theme was cottage country. It was the relationship of Canadians to the natural environment as an everyday, regular thing. I think, you know, probably Swedes and a few other nations have a very large proportion of the population who have cottages or who get out to the country on a regular basis. So I had studied all sorts of different aspects of this, both the what I call little houses with big trees or around them, or castles in the wilderness, those crazy hotels that people go out to in the Rocky Mountains and so on. And I tried to develop some typologies and so on. So I'd like to continue working on that and turn it into something. The other main subject was the end of the agricultural myth in Quebec, which was a more esoteric kind of subject, but there was a time when what's called le mythe agraire, the agrarian myth in Quebec, was central to everybody's thinking. It was, let's say, if just reading the last few pages of Maria Chapdelaine communicates this very well, that the true survival of Quebec lies in agriculture and in rural areas. The cities are evil, that people are exploited in urban environments. This was a very deep philosophy in Quebec, but it's over. And it didn't just end with the Quiet Revolution in the 60s, it ended about 30 years before. And I think people like Marie Victorin, the founder of the Botanical Gardens, he actually carried out a multi-pronged attack on that philosophy. He created a science faculty at the University of Montreal, and he created a very widespread system of horticultural clubs among young people. There was a whole lot of things that people like him were involved in. So I was trying to kind of trace that out, but that was really far from landscape architecture. The editor said, you know, the word landscape architect is not actually mentioned in this chapter even once. So, you know, you can take this out and work it up later, which I did, when it was very good advice. Yeah.
One more question from Jeremy.
Here's the landscape that very few Canadians see, which country go as most And I had a very different experience when I went out to the Torrens. I thought people were great, but when I asked them what they did with their holidays and how they used landscape recreational, they did not. They went south. They went to landscapes that were
Yeah.
so pristine within which to recreate.
Absolutely. And in fact, just a couple of years ago, the annual Congress of the CSLA, Canadian Society of Landscape Architects, was held in Iqaluit. And there were a lot of people there, and it was really astonishing to see what was going on there, because there are no trees. There are hardly any shrubs. The vegetation is about this high at the most. And so it's a stonescape. So people do everything with stones and rocks and gravel. There is wood, but every single bit of it is imported from the south, and it's at a premium. And somehow, people are able to work with those materials and really create some quite successful landscapes. And I think we saw in Yellowknife also, which is well within the tree line, that for example, the capital of the Northwest Territories, which was the landscape architect was Cornelia Overlander. That's an absolutely striking project. She did a great job, and the architect also did an outstanding job. I think the challenges are huge. Let's see, there's a lot going on in the territories that is not publicized. There are diamond mines, and they're so wealthy. There's diamond mines, there's gold, there's just all kinds of minerals, and one doesn't get to see those things on a regular basis, so it's as if they're on another planet. You know, it might be that bad things are happening there and we don't know anything about them, and we won't know for 20 years, so people should be involved with those things. And I think government has to play an infinitely stronger role, but the territorial governments are stepping up. So, for example, Nunavut has a ministry of climate change. As far as I know, that's the only political component of Canada that has a ministry of climate change, and their job is just to think about that, because it's disastrous for them.
Great. Thank you all very much. Before we stop for a little more beverage and some food that'll be available until 9, I want to take this opportunity to thank our 2 guests, and we have a small token of our appreciation for them. That's great. I think this kind of discussion is very healthy. Ron, I can't thank you enough for taking the time out of your life to make this book. It is wonderful. It's a great thing. Every landscape architect in Canada should read it. So as I said, that is the end of our formal part of the evening. Hang around a bit and socialize. There will be still some beverages and some food. Thank you all, and have a safe trip home.